right, we got 1D Talks, the nerd chat segment here. So, Mr. Mike Catherwood, I was just saying because I'm boring and dry, so we needed some personality, so I asked him to join in. Mr. Justin Hokams, I got a wealth of knowledge between hormones, testing, optimal health, all those things, and then Mr. Kurt Havens joined us today to talk about anything and everything. So excited to get onto this. So thanks for joining today, guys.
Very cool.
Thank you.
On the email list, when I saw the names, Mike Catherwood was the host of Loveline.
That's right.
That. Thought maybe we're in for like a really special guest today.
There you go. Well, you guys were talking about something before we started recording today. So do you want to kick that off, Mike? Sure.
Yeah, Mike? I especially with Kurt and Justin here, and that who have what would be considered professional level and higher level understanding with like hormones, and then also practices of people who make a living off their physique, be it physique models, bodybuilders, fitness models, things like that. There's a lot you can learn and glean from people like that, as far as mindset, as far as, training techniques. And of course, these are the people who do it the best. But there's also nowadays with the internet where people have literally access to whatever information they want. I think a lot of regular people who just want to look better in the mirror are adopting some of these practices, and A, it could be dangerous, and B, it burns them out as it would most anybody. And I just wanted to maybe bring up and get your guys' take on when the average person can make that decision on, yes, this is great for me to adopt and follow, and this is not applicable to regular Joe or regular gal.
Do you want to go first, Justin, or you want me to go?
Yeah, I was, thinking, I guess a lot of it comes down to the goal of the individual and where they are in life. Similar to what Kurt was saying, when I first started bodybuilding, I was listening to a supplement guy at the shop that was taking like methyltren that was sold as like some pro hormone, and, fertility wasn't even a concern, and, liver support and all those things. I think like for an individual, it comes down to what you're wanting to achieve and what you're willing to risk. Those are usually the questions when I'm sitting down and consulting with somebody, is like, you can take in, where you are, potential like familial component in there as well. And then kind of like, are you trying to go to the Olympia, or are you trying to just look good at the beach? I think those protocols are probably a lot different. What would you say to that, Kurt?
I think you brought up two really interesting points. So I think bodybuilding, like any sport, is a game of genetics, right? So, and that is determined, your response to food, drugs, and training is what's going to dictate how far you can go in the world of physique stuff. We're all limited at some point, right? The four of us most likely would never become Nick Walker. Right. That's a genetic limit, though. That's not necessarily a drug limit, regardless of what people want to think. I think a lot of it has to do with the factors you said, and also the risk that you brought up. So what I notice with the pros, most likely open pros, the bigger guys, it's their risk tolerance is much greater than normal people. And so they're willing to do whatever it takes to win. And their value, I don't want to phrase it wrong. Let's say their value for life isn't quite the same as, it doesn't mean it's less. It's just different than, a normal guy who's got a wife and kids per se. I think I typically the drugs need to align with your training, how long you've been training, your food intake. If you have a guy who's 35 years old, has been in the gym kind of casually for a couple years, and his diet's not really that great, and he's kind of just figuring stuff out, weighs 165 pounds, does he need 5 grams of gear? No, because it's not going to do anything, right? He's just going to get side effects at that point, most likely. So it's like, he's a guy that perhaps it's TRT. Perhaps once TRT runs its course and he wants more, maybe it's exploring something more, but like the odds of him working up to a pro level cycle, probably not going to happen. Right. And same with like a young kid. Again, most of the pros, unfortunately, probably start drugs when they're 16 or 17. But their response to it is just different. They're the kids who make huge progress. When people ask me what makes you, how do you know if you're a genetic freak? You would know because you'd be the biggest guy in the gym in the first 6 months you were in there. Right. Like, they're always noticeable. Any gym you walk in, you can always tell the guys who are the greatest genetics. They're not like the average guy who's benching 135. It's the freak kid in high school who's benching 405 when he's 17.
I think that's a really important point to bring up, because people, they are kind of so on the fence, especially if you have the mindset of like, I really want this, and you're willing to follow through with doing what it takes. But I have an old adage that I used to apply to it that doesn't have to do with bodybuilding necessarily, but being in recovery with drug and alcohol addiction, I've had so many, especially younger kids, that would be like, dude, I'm confused. And it's like, how do I know I'm an alcoholic, or how do I know I'm a drug addict? I was like, there should be no question. If you are, believe me, maybe you're just getting to the point in your life where you might be considering there's a problem. And I understand there can be some confusion there, but people who aren't never really go down that path of like, I think I might be a drug addict. It's like, no, that's not something that people battle with on a day-to-day basis. That's something that only comes about if more than likely you already have a problem. And I think like, I don't think Ronnie Coleman and Nick Walker like ever contemplated whether or not they were good responders, or genetic freaks.
Yeah. And, I see a lot, it's sad. I see a lot of crossover between the world of alcoholism and drug addiction and bodybuilding and physique sports. It's called transgressive behavior, right? You take one addiction and you pass it to something else. You can't really the theory is that you can't really get rid of an addiction once it's developed in your brain. You have to create another space for it. So that's also something that I deal with a lot, is that people that they constantly want more and they're not ready for more.
Yeah.
Right. Like a guy that's supposed to just be on TRT, but he constantly wants to add Primo or Masteron. Like it's this constant thriving for something, or you see in chasing a feeling, which to me is an addictive personality thing. When guys chase sexual feeling with steroids, right? Like they first start TRT and they're very like sexually aroused, and then it fades, right? It becomes homeostatic. We get used to everything. And then all of a sudden they're like, my sex drive is not the same. What do I need to add? It's like, is your sex drive really not good, or is it you just used to what it was? It can't stay super elevated all the time. You're not 14.
And I see that a lot, not only in the gym, but also in my experience with combat sports, where all the time, us folks that are in recovery, you have to have that talk with yourself. You have to have that, however long it may last, but you have to have that issue where you understand, like, right now, I'm doing something positive by all accounts. I'm getting into jujitsu. I'm getting into Muay Thai. I'm getting into bodybuilding. It's building myself. It's positive. But you come from a mindset we've already identified where you get off on managing punishment, managing self-punishment. And when you're talking about destroying your muscles with deadlifts and high rep squats, or getting punched in the face, or getting choked out, it can get really into this messy territory where now you're taking something that is positive and you've turned it into this kind of masochistic endeavor where you're just managing your self-punishment,
Well, I think too, like I was talking to, just to kind of even zoom out even more, like I was talking to a group of high school athletes recently, and I just broke down some basic eating patterns to get into, like pre and post strength training and, fuel sources. It wasn't exact doing the science, the numbers just yet. It was just carbohydrates to fuel your workout, hydration, sodium, moderate protein. Like, let's just get you eating, because their questions were, and they were younger, so it wasn't, gear related, but it was, what supplements should I take? And I said, unless you're doing that for 3 or 4 years, guys, like you don't necessarily need like a supplement. A supplement is exactly in the word, like it supplements the food that you can't get in because your schedule. Now there might be some utility there, maybe even like a carb powder or something.
This is the man who runs a supplement company, by the way.
Yeah.
There's a lot of dignity right here.
So but our products are applicable to a very specific user with a very specific need, right? So that's what I was trying to explain to them, is if you're going from school and you had lunch at noon, 3 o'clock weight room, 5 o'clock you're going to soccer practice. That was one of the kids I talked to. It's like, yeah, you're probably going to need something, but here's some other food sources you can add in there. And then if you fast forward that to, like you said, like the bodybuilder, et cetera, like how many people want to more, but they forget there's still some building blocks in your body, regardless of what you're putting in there to help stimulate growth. You still need the raw materials to grow. And then the genetic potential, which I do feel like it's a little interesting to me. I wonder, and Kurt, you might be the best person to comment on this. This is a curiosity, like some pros, do they have a higher genetic barrier based on how long and how much gear they can take to where their bodies don't break down. Is that also potentially in that correlation? Like I'm a hyper responder, but also I can do this stuff for 10, 15, 20 years. And, you know, my heart's okay. My fill in the blank's okay. I wonder how much of that is. 'Cause I saw a lot of guys younger that had some complications, you know, earlier in their careers to where they really couldn't reach that peak. So I don't know if you've seen that or heard of that at all.
I mean, so you have what we found is what generally dictates your response to drugs is your androgen receptor density that you're born with. So we're all born with a certain amount. They then increase in content as you increase the androgen load in the body. So if you're always natural, your content will stay roughly the same unless as you age, clearly as your androgen levels drop, the receptors will over time disappear. But what dictates, and so there's also 300 genes that dictate the outcome in muscle. This 78, I might be wrong, that steroids alone impact inside of muscle. So different steroids impact different genes too. Like nandrolone impacts a different gene set than testosterone versus trenbolone. We see like actin. You also have, I don't know if you guys know the actin gene. So there's 2 and 3. Actin 3 is in fast twitch muscle fibers. Guys that are more actin 3 dominant tend to grow more muscle mass versus guys who are dominant actin 2 tend to be more endurance athletes. They're both elite in their own categories. They're just elite in different ways, right? But we're talking about like size and strength and those kind of things. That's generally actin 3. You also have so when I say androgen receptor density, you have the classic androgen receptor, which is bound to heat shock proteins inside the cell. And when it senses an androgen, it releases from the heat shock protein. It basically attaches to the androgen and it comes inside and it causes gene transcription. And that's where your genetics come into play. That's literally genetics because it's causing DNA, RNA transcription. You also have a level of androgen receptors that are on the cell surface that we're not really sure how they end up there and why they stay there, because from a structural point of view, they're the same. So something occurred at some point in our lives that allowed them to stay there and they don't come in. They're what they call non-genomic response. So they're immediate. As soon as either, you know, your testicles secrete testosterone or you inject, if you just use something fast acting or an oral, they immediately within seconds cause a response. That's where you get rapid heart rate, you get strength, you get aggression. They're not causing muscle growth per se. They're causing the other effects. They also tend to be on our organs. So depending on the concentration, like you're saying, a guy who would have the best chance of being a great bodybuilder would have all the things aligning perfectly, right? He'd have a ton of classic ARs, actin 3 dominant. He would have all the correct genes expressed for both fat loss and muscle gain. He'd have great insertions, all of those panacean angles, all the things that go with what we consider like the best athlete. And he probably has a low concentration of androgen receptors on his organs. Or he doesn't need enough androgens because he has so many receptors that he doesn't have to take enough that his organs are getting affected. So similar to like fish oil, when you use androgens, there's basically an overflow at a certain point when the classics are saturated and your body can't regenerate new ones fast enough, it'll start to overflow to other places that aren't really ideal, like your brain, right? You see like the hypothalamus gets hit really hard and that's like mood things when you take trenbolone. So it could just be like a perfect storm. Like you don't see it very often though, right? Like most of those guys, unfortunately, that make it that far also end up dying early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was curious too. Maybe it's for you, both you and Justin, but guys who are either naturally trying to increase testosterone or maybe they're like TRT. Are there other things that you found that, you know, help optimize what they're taking? So I'm, you know, if I'm a guy on a TRT dose, 150 milligrams, could I get a higher percentage of that that's actually being used for the good stuff? You know, like, is there certain things you've seen that are true? You see a lot of clips and reels about take this and do this and increases the blah, blah, blah. But how much of that is really making a difference versus it just kind of sounds cool on a clip, you know?
Well, I mean, you can answer some of the TRT stuff that you guys see. From a basic point of view, I mean, you want to make sure that you're not deficient in anything, right? If you're deficient in vitamins and minerals, obviously macronutrients, if you obviously don't get enough food, protein, carbohydrates, and things like that, you're not going to grow. But you see tons of guys that like literally don't have any B vitamins, like, or, you know, they have no zinc. Like, unless you're supplementing appropriately, how do you expect your body to grow? It'd be like expecting a tree to grow in really crappy sand. They're just not going to grow.
I think you make a good point there. And that was a question, you know, I was going to bring up is like, how many of those top level pros do you think are deficient in those things? I think most of them are deficient based off of their diet. You know, they're eating very simple carbohydrates and maybe chicken or maybe some steak, but you don't see a lot of greens and micronutrients in there. So that was going to be a question I was going to ask you, as well as like, I know you're not like really versed on GI mapping, but like, do you think those things are applicable? Because the digestive tract does wear down over time, and we're cramming all that food. How do we keep that thing working and not destroying that mucosal layer and keeping microbiota happy and not overgrown?
Yeah, no, I think digestion is huge. I just don't like GI mapping per se. I just don't, I was not taught that, so I can't read all of those bacteria. No, you can only use what you can basically absorb, right? I mean, we're absorbing most, otherwise it's diarrhea if it's not fully getting absorbed. It doesn't mean you're actually utilizing it correctly, right? And also steroids sometimes make the absorption worse. IGF through growth hormone or on its own, like use Increlux, will cause the intestines to do weird things, so you can really screw up the way you actually can utilize these food. And like you said, most bodybuilders or at the pro level really probably don't pay attention to stuff like that. I mean, there are some, like Wesley Vissers always stood out to me because he cares a ton about his health and he spends a ton of time eating fruits and vegetables and things like that. And there are other guys like, I know Roman Fritz is very cognizant of like things like fish oil and those kind of things. Like, so there are guys out there that are paying attention. Most of the guys that come to me I probably attract the guys who are aware of that sort of thing. But as a whole, if you eat nothing but chicken or rice 6 meals a day for 20 years, your health is not going to be optimal.
Yeah, and it also gets into it's kind of the same thing with training too, where like when you're relegating everything to what's optimal for just my gains, for stepping on stage, you're overlooking things that would probably keep you in the game longer and optimize your ability long term for, like I mean, I talk to so many guys that are smaller naturally. Myself, I'm naturally smaller, and so it's like I'm so aversive to anything cardio, anything that might burn calories because I'm a little guy. But it's like, well, if I worked in some really well structured, some really prudent, low level aerobic stuff all the time, I would probably be able to train harder. My recovery be better for a longer period of time. It's like, that health based stuff, that just naturally healthy, what is going to make you a better unit, regardless of, the aesthetics, almost always is going to make your capacity to have the aesthetics be better and more long term.
Yeah. And a guy like you, if that's a struggle, you could just eat back those calories, and that's easier said than done. You're probably already eating a lot of food, but
it's way easier to do that than to
there were years that I did no cardio, and I ran track in college. So it was something I grew up doing. And then I kind of stopped when my focus was just getting bigger. It was the same as you. It was like anything that takes away from me gaining size. And then I realized like I was wheezing, I was snoring, like my blood work wasn't fantastic. Like all those things kind of go down the toilet at a certain point. Even on the outside, you look, right? You're like the picture of health, and my wife was kind of the one that turned me on to that because we've been together for 20 years. So she's seen different phases in my life. And she was always like, when we were younger, I thought bodybuilding was about health. And she goes, now I realize when you're prepping for a show, how incredibly unhealthy you are, right? Because at that point, it doesn't matter. Health is like the least of my concerns.
Right.
Like you're on death's door. Anyone who's ever competed or fighting at any high level, right? Like, you can barely move. I couldn't get off the couch to pee.
And that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought that up. And that goes for MMA and combat sports and bodybuilding. And look, my wife's an actor. And when you're talking about prepping for a role, it's like, well, yeah, I saw Jake Gyllenhaal's Roadhouse preparation. And a guy like, I'm not saying that's not amazing. I'm not saying that's not great. But do you have a professional chef? Do you have people on set that are bringing you food? Because I've been on sets. I was through a connection of other people. I was on the set for Pain and Gain, and The Rock. I saw it with my own eyes. The Rock has a dude whose job it is to bring him shrimp and rice every 2 hours. And like, do you have that? And are you getting $17 million to do this? Because if you're not, believe me, it's not sustainable, and it's not probably worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, so this is my life basically revolves around this stuff. So I have the ability to cook and eat whatever I want, whenever I want, within reason. So, but I keep that in perspective. I don't recommend that people necessarily live outside their like lifestyle means, because it's not realistic, right? Like I would rather, that's the time I would utilize supplements. Like if a guy can't, I don't expect most people to eat chicken every 6 hours or every 2 hours. So that's, perhaps it's a protein shake in between lunch and dinner if you can't.
Mm-hmm.
get something down. I think that's a great time for supplements. But like you said, you're supplementing because there's a need that you can't meet, not just to add garbage to your diet.
Right.
And I think that's like probably the biggest thing, especially with the younger generation. They want to supplement their way out of things. And I'm like, dude, you can't like just take your multivitamin, take your greens, and like you have to, try to get a lot of these foods in and have some diversity. Your microbiota relies on diversity of food. So, you can't just eat your chicken and rice and take your multi and everything's going to be okay.
And that's the same with the drugs, right? And you probably said with TRT, I think that's like the most misused term now ever. Right? Like hormone replacement therapy has been around for a long time, longer than I've been alive, but it was always kept as just that. And like with the invention of social media, you see guys that are in their 20s that are on TRT. Like were you actually hypogonadal, or did your doctor just put you on 300 milligrams of test because you asked for it? Right. And then what are you leveraging from it? Right. Because it's supposed to just be replacing what you've lost. It's not supposed to be used for performance. I think that that's also like severely misused. Again, people can do whatever they choose. It's their body. I just think the term isn't correct, and it skews what we all do for a living when people misuse these terms or misunderstand.
I'm glad you brought that up. And that actually bothers me a lot. I would have not thought to talk about that, but thank you for mentioning that. And, Kurt, Joe, and I probably have a little bit of a cheat code because we lived in an era and probably got really invested in this stuff prior to having the internet and TikTok and whatnot. And Justin, I'd be interested to hear your take on it, that, people are going rather immediately to extreme means. And it's not just with drugs. Drugs is there's a very good sense of clarity with that, because you're talking about extremes, but even with like reductionist diets, it's like, hey, I want to get in shape for summer, so I'm just not going to eat anything but steak, because I heard some dude talk about he lost a lot of weight doing it. And like everything is there seems to be, let's go from A to Z, and they're, just completely avoiding the B, C, D, E. And that that really was not an option for me at 18 to 25. And I'd just be curious to hear, like, how do you make sense of that? And then also, how do you try to deal with getting people to move away from stuff that would probably give results in an immediate sense, which is what everybody's looking for? Look at Ozempic and whatnot, to try to look at something that would be more sustainable and long-term and probably fulfilling in the end.
From my point of view, I'm fortunate. I think I attract clients that seem to kind of think that at least a little bit from the beginning. Even the pros, the pros that come to me generally are concerned about these things. They're not the guys that like are willing to die necessarily. I was natural until I was 39. Like I was adamantly against these things. I study it because I realized in school that doctors aren't taught these things, and the ridiculous things you would hear about testosterone and these things, and that doctors would tell people, it was just totally misunderstood. And I realized that since the mid 80s, when the FDA cracked down on these steroids, outside of one guy named Bazin in the 90s, there was really, in the early 2000s, there was really no one that was studying this stuff. And I was like, this is a huge hole, right? We have this massive industry where all these people are doing these drugs and no one understands them.
Yeah. So
that's kind of where I get, but like, so I'm pretty hard on my clients, especially the lifestyle guys that don't need to use a ton of stuff. I don't care if they're middle-aged and they need to be on TRT, then by all means be on TRT. But the guys that are like, what if I add 200 milligrams of this or that? I give them a lot of pushback on that stuff. It's not really the way I want to do things if I don't have to. I think people need to learn how to eat. They need to learn how to train. They need to see how their body deals with recovery, what it feels like to be natural. If you don't know how to grow muscle or train, and you don't know what it feels like to get sore, or you've overtrained, or you know, any of those things, like, drugs aren't going to do you any good. Because once you don't have those drugs, you're screwed. And the ride ends. No one wants to think about this, but like big blasts of steroid use, it ends at some point for everyone. Whether you get one steroid cycle in your life or you get 50, at some point your health will go, or your hair will go, like mine. Like, something happens and you'll have to stop. So it's like, you have to figure out how to do it without them.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. When I started bodybuilding, it was probably a decade ago, and it was only for weirdos and people were like, hey, why do you want to bodybuild? That's so weird. And I used to work out at Metroflex in Austin, and it was just this warehouse gym, and all the bodybuilders were super rude to me because I was small, and I didn't like have they wanted you to get some, credibility, get in there and train hard. And now everybody with social media, I think it's more for glam, and people have really made it out to be this, I don't know, this idea that it's great, and it is great. But I think for young guys, you have to realize that you want to do it, and training naturally, like, I think those things are really important to do before just starting to take steroids, because you may, you just started training, you just started taking steroids, you may do it for 6 months, be like, hey, I hate this. Like, I don't want to bodybuild. And now you've completely disrupted all of your endocrine function. And it's going to be a while till you restore those things. And you're probably going to look worse after that cycle than you did going into the initial cycle. So those are things that I think about. And like, I think there's just a big push and a lot of pressure for body image for men right now, and to look a certain way based off of social media, and it's kind of driving kids to start doing extreme things, which is unfortunate, to a degree.
I mean, I think that the image of health should be there, right? Like, I don't disagree with that, but I think the extreme image of looking up to pros when you're 18 in an unrealistic way is not the healthiest thing.
Yeah, well, that carries across the board, man. Like how that the social media and like just the overindulgence of hyper reality, right? Because for the most part, I mean, I'm compared to Earth, I have a good body, right? But I'm not gonna win any contests or get on any magazine covers. But I use small little filters. I'm a pretty reasonable guy, but I take pictures with my cell phone, and I definitely go take a 2 or 3 and like look for the one with the best lighting, you know what I'm saying? And like, but that's the best they're getting, because most of it's like AI imagery of this extreme stuff, and it's not just bodies, and it's not just men and women having to do it. It's like 19-year-old, 18-year-old kid right now think it's like, how do I make it if I don't have a Bugatti and I don't vacation in Bali and then go to Saudi Arabia to my flat where I have a harem of whores? Like, everything is so over, like, I mean, preposterously exaggerated, that I feel like people miss out on the reality of what it means to be like fulfilled. And that certainly, like, I think, the physique stuff is a great world to get like just a crash course on how distorted stuff gets. And especially we see it, I think, with how guys and their musculature and their leanness. Women nowadays, it's like, I see 50-year-old women who they're in great shape and they look fine. And they're like, if I don't have a 75-inch ass with a 19-inch waist, clearly I'm not doing a good job. And I was like, we understand that's not a real image. I mean, that's just not reality,
Well, I wanted to bring up something too. I want to go through a couple of your posts, Kurt, and then some of your more in-depth scientific posts. I think we started off talking a little bit about social media and bad information. I think there's a lot of good information on your Instagram, so I'd point people to that. But also, so I want to kind of pull up a couple and talk about them. But while we're going through them, have you guys think in the back of your mind of like, maybe you don't want to say names, maybe you do, that's fine. But just like some of the nonsense you've seen out there, I'd be interested to maybe share that with the audience too, like of a post or some kind of claim that was just such bull crap. Maybe we can get to that, but before we jump into that, I was going to show your one of your let's see here.
So post. Something I'm adamant, I don't know if you guys probably don't follow me, I know Joe does, but like, I'm very big into communicating the truth in this stuff, and if I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know, or I'll correct stuff. I have no problem backing up and correcting stuff. There's so much misinformation out there about the human body.
I thought this was a pretty in-depth post, and I know, Justin Hokams, you've looked at thousands of labs, and with blood pressure concerns and people in kidney health, I thought maybe you can kind of unpack what you were talking about here overall, and just, obviously there's a lot to unpack there. People can read the post, but just overall, like kidney function, good testing for that. What are some things that, would be signs and symptoms of people are having issues there, and so on?
Well, obviously we get labs, right? Labs are super important, whether you're enhanced or you're not enhanced. Like the average adult should be getting blood work at least annually, if not biannually. Steroids magnify all these issues, and you see this. I think also, not to go on a tangent, also with things like kidney health, you see a lot of guys that are really mismanaging other things that are then going to cause downstream kidney problems. So one of the biggest trends now that you see is estrogen being run really high. I can get into that if you want after.
Sure.
When you do that, you're going to cause a subsequent amount of water retention and mineral retention. And then there's also androgens will also stimulate water retention on their own through a different process. And then instead of managing the estrogen, guys will then take blood pressure medicine to reduce the symptoms instead of addressing the actual issue. And then on top of it, you mentioned sodium before. So sodium is a very misunderstood thing as well. So there's a big trend. I think some of it probably started in supplement industries because salt is cheap. And we're mimicking what endurance athletes are doing. So we're drinking salt water, right? So I've seen hundreds of thousands of labs. I've not ever seen an American that was actually deficient in sodium, unless they purposely drank a gallon of water right before the labs are drawn. So I'm hesitant to really recommend that most people drink. Most people are deficient in potassium. But again, when you take things like telmisartan, you've now flipped it. So then you're not deficient anymore, but it's artificial. Like now you're retaining it. With kidney health, though, my big thing is like a lot of general practitioners, you get labs done, right? Or some clinics, if they're not taught the right way to look at these labs, a lot of these markers would be just skewed from exercise or high protein diet. It's not necessarily wrong. EGFR is a scary one, though, because I saw one today where a guy's was about 50% of what it should be at his age. And his doctor said nothing to him. So I'm friends with him, and he sent me my labs. He said it didn't feel good. He was having some side effects, and I look at his labs, and I said, you need to see a nephrologist now. So that's when it's scary. But I think some of the other ones, the bun, the creatinine, those things are those are normal byproducts of what we do with our bodies, right? You're using your body. Medicine's based on averages, and they basically sampled a bunch of people that ate 2,000 calories a day and sat on a couch all day, drew their blood, and was like, you look perfect. We're going to use you as the example for what health is. And then we come in the room, and all of a sudden we look like we're broken.
Yeah, I know you have some ranges here, but what is something that in some of those other markers that could probably be written off as training and protein, and then what is something where in those other markers where maybe it is concerning, or is there a level there, a range?
Well, like EGFR, if it's below, if it's cut, some of it depends on age too, but if it's if it's 50, 40, if it starts to get low, like it should be closer to 90 for most people. If it starts to get like half of that, it's probably time to see someone. There might be other things that can cause it to go, but again, high blood pressure chronically can cause it. Diabetes can cause it. There's underlying things that a lot of people don't know. I mean, how many Americans have type 2 diabetes that don't even realize they're diabetic?
Right.
And we probably catch it. As a coach, I see it often. You look at people's labs and their A1C is super high, right? From forcing food for years or growth hormone, like too many things. They're just abusing their body over and over again.
What are your thoughts on cystatin C? That's a conversation that a lot of people are having.
Most doctors don't use that, but that's a good one. Yeah, I think that the standard, the bun and stuff, they don't really, unless they're really skewed, they don't mean that much.
I have to speak up too, because I had the luxury. This is way outside my pay grade, but I did, I spent 17 years sitting next to Dr. Drew, who's a physician, an MD, and also jacked. And I would always have kind of the similar questions that any of you, probably you three, and then also a lot of people listening and watching, is that if we identify anyone with a above average kind of intellect can step back and look at it, like, well, then why are doctors doing this? And he said, that's our job. Our hands are tied. I cannot, if I have a patient come in, and of course I'm having 20 a day as opposed to 9 as I probably should have.
Like 50 a day.
Right. Yeah. Like he's probably got, on the luxury end. He's probably a lot better off than most doctors. And they come in, they're pre-diabetic. I have to solve that problem before they walk out the door. That's my job as an American MD. And if I don't do that, I am running the risk of getting in trouble. If I see someone who comes in and they broke their foot 6 years ago and they're still taking Oxy, I want to pull them aside and go like, listen, you're going to die. And if I do that, I run the risk of getting my medical license taken away, because my job is they have this problem and they have identified it. I have to do no harm and then give them their medication. That's all I have. I have a scalpel and I have medication. Those are the things as an MD that I have in this country to deal with it. And he's like, I literally can't pull them aside and be like, your blood pressure is probably high because you have chicken strips and pizza for breakfast, you know, like, or your blood, you know, like, as opposed to just giving them metformin or something. And so I think that I'm not making excuses for it, but I do think like the problem lies in what we want as patients for the most part when we walk in those doors, but also like the system as a whole. The same, because since moving to Central Texas, and then I train at Tim Kennedy's Academy. Now my friend network has become very largely either active duty military or veterans, and then you get this problem where I totally understand, and I want people to express themselves because this is America, right? But they make these horrible, disparaging claims about the U.S. military. I go, you understand, it's not the men and women over there fighting. Like, I understand on paper, the policies are something you can do, but don't take it out on this poor guy who, when he was 19, just flew over to Afghanistan to fight for his country. Like, it has nothing. And I feel like there's a lot of similarity with doctors themselves. It's not the men and women out there who are MDs who work their whole life to become MDs. There's a systemic kind of problem that overall because most people are unhealthy and most people are making these bad decisions on a day-to-day basis. And then they go into those offices like, well, what is this doctor supposed to do other than give them medication or give them surgery? You know, they're kind of limited.
Well, you have to, so from a doctor's point of view, you're not taught those things necessarily about health, right? There's not a single class where food is mentioned. Right. The Krebs cycle is discussed in physiology, but like, it's not discussed in terms of like what we do. It's discussed in terms of like metabolism as it applies to things like cancer. You don't want to find as a doctor anything what you call actionable on labs either. So when a doctor writes, like if you go to your general practitioner and you ask for blood work, he's going to give you the most basic crap ever, because if I'm saying he or she can't understand or interpret those labs, which they're not taught how to, like, I don't read cardiac stuff. Like, I understand the basic stuff, but I just deal with the endocrine end of things. I don't typically go outside of that. So I can't really speak to that. If you find something that's actionable and that you wrote for, you're responsible for it. So like, sometimes I've had experiences with people with cancer that I've asked for other markers from an oncologist or urologist or something, and they generally just ignore me because they don't want to be responsible for it, or then I have to deal with it. I have to then write my own because I become responsible if we find something. They don't want to deal with it. So doctors also want to wash their hands of that stuff, and it is much easier. I mean, how do you solve something in 10 minutes?
Yeah.
You can't. And like, they don't have time to deal with like your lifestyle stuff because most people's lifestyle is really screwed up. Like they just don't have time. And that's not them. I don't think that's why people got into medicine. I think they got into medicine to help. I think the insurance and all the other things through the medical system are just broken at this point. And the demand is too high and there's just not enough time in a day. I mean, I know lots of doctors that see at least 50 people a day. How do you deal with, imagine if you had to have 50 consult calls as a coach a day.
Right.
How would you get anything done? You're not going to give anyone quality service.
No.
You know,
I mean, that's one luxury of me not being very good at this that I can really lean into, is that I only have to talk to like a couple people a day.
It's wild. But like, if you're like your clinic, what you do is online, or you guys have people in person?
Me.
Yeah, Justin.
Like you guys. Yeah, I worked online for the longest time. Yeah.
It's probably easier because it's probably faster to turn around people than it is if they're walking in and out, right? Like,
you're exactly right, though. It's like you go to your primary care, they don't even address your issue. You go in there, they talk to you for 5 minutes, and you wanted to look at something else, but they're quick to come out, check your blood pressure, check your pulse, and if you need a script, write that script, and they're on to the next room. So I think that concierge medicine is going to be more relevant as we go into things like in the future, just because you can have medical staff there to kind of tee up things for providers to make that a little bit more streamlined and maybe get to the root cause of issues. So I am optimistic for where medicine is going, but right now I do think that your standard primary care, they do a good job of keeping you alive, but really helping you thrive and feel better. It's just not what they're there to do, unfortunately.
No, the system is set up to keep you healthy.
Yeah, you mentioned that too. Like I was talking to a doc recently and talking about like the hopes for like AI integrations in the future to give some more information on the context of those lab markers and things of that nature. Because there's a lot of markers that people, some docs don't even know because there's not a diagnosis code per se, because it's so proactive of a marker that insurance is going to cover it. Their insurance-based billing practice. They're not cash based, so they just don't even go down that, and so therefore their patients don't know about it. But I think some more in-depth versus just your markers, but in-depth explanations of kind of what's going on in the body. But I'm just curious for you guys too, like any other markers out there that you see that on that point, I guess, that people should know about or should be checking, whether they're using anabolics or not, or heavy training or high output athletes.
Well, like liver is kind of similar to kidney, right? ALT, AST are pretty useless. Like they're not really markers unless you see them in the thousands. Like liver failure is usually like 2,000 ALT. It's way higher than you're going to see from like Anavar.
You like a GGT usually? If we're looking,
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
most
GGT
doctors are right for that stuff. Again, it's ALT and it's like over by 10 points, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, your liver's failing.
It's like, no, you trained hard, or you took an aspirin, and that's what you took an aspirin the day before, and that's why it's high. What are your thoughts on some other inflammatory markers? Like, do you think there's any use of like a homocysteine? The reason I ask that is if we look at bodybuilding and using anabolic steroids, me personally, my homocysteine will go up 10, 15 points depending on androgen load. And, I think I'm having a lot of issues completing that cycle to make glutathione. And something that I noticed with myself is I get a very bad histamine responses, specifically with 19-NOR. So I drive those up, and I may get some eczema, or I may get a rash under my eye. And I've been trying to kind of hit all those cofactors and try to add additional glutathione to alleviate that. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you see other bodybuilders with histamine issues? And do you ever look at homocysteine as an applicable?
I do, because it pertains to like heart health too. Like it's a good predictor of like really how long you're going to live. And a lot of the things, I'll try not to speak like out of like above my pay grade when it comes to like cardiac stuff, but a lot of the issues you see with like cholesterol and stuff aren't per se the cholesterol. It's the inflammation that's occurring that's allowing the cholesterol to do the damage. And that's hugely important. Weightlifting itself is an inflammatory response, and that's required in order to make an adaptation. That's how mechanical growth factor works. That being said, you have to manage it, right? You don't need it to get out of hand. And you do see histamine reactions. So histamine's funny. So prostaglandins are what kind of cause satellite cell proliferation, and they're related to histamines. Histamines, for the most part, seem more responsive to estrogens than they do to androgens. So 19-NORs would make sense, because especially if it's nandrolone, you'll see some level of, because it's going to magnify the estrogen receptor and the estrogen response, and also block the androgen receptor to some degree as well. So you might get an elevated, skin response or something from it. Trembolone, you usually don't, in my experience, you generally don't see so much of a histamine response, unless perhaps someone made it from pellets that had estrogen in it, or something, or you could be allergic to something, carrier oil or something. But I do see it with guys. You even see with DHT stuff. I've seen with masteron, I've seen with testosterone. If people let their estrogen go too high, you do see histamine responses. That's why women tend to get those allergic reactions worse than men.
Absolutely. My question, because we were talking about estrogen, in managing estrogen, Kurt, so someone comes to you and they have high levels of estrogen. What are you looking at? Let's your top important things to maybe control estrogen, and, steps on how you would do that for a bodybuilder.
So to back up for a second and not to get too controversial. So estrogen itself, in and of itself, is not necessarily an anabolic hormone. It's not what causes muscle growth. It's not what causes muscle growth in women either. That's generally progesterone. And that's where nandrolone was discovered in the fetus. So estrogen helps with glycogen storage. That's why if you crush your estrogen, you get really flat and stringy. You're not necessarily stunting growth. So the bodybuilding thing about IGF, estrogen is basically like a regulatory factor that's going to bind IGF to make it useless. Just because the serum level goes up doesn't mean your body's doing anything with it. What we're looking for is intramuscular IGF that matters, because that has to splice to MGF. When it's bound in serum, it's not doing anything per se. It's like DHT. It's useless. What I would look at first, if assuming that they're on androgens, if they're not on androgens and the estrogen is high, we have to do something totally different, right? Because for a natural individual, that ratio of testosterone to estrogen is super important. On androgens, there are some known ranges, but it gets really skewed fast. I don't generally use ranges because there's so many variables when it comes to steroids, like what the range. I would tend, unless someone is very large and very experienced and running a large amount of gear, I would tend to keep most people's estrogen in that actual range that's on the blood work, and not run. It can run on the top end of that, but I wouldn't typically let it go higher than that. It's not advantageous, right? So even if you look at things like cancer, estrogen, when it goes back through the liver, it hydroxylates and it can become a carcinogen. So you don't really want to run estrogen really high, like prostate cancer, colon cancer. Those things are related to that to some degree. I would typically, it depends. I'm of the school of thought, like if you're just on TRT and your estrogen is high, I mean, perhaps it's changing your dosing frequency. Maybe it's going to daily dosing. Maybe it's reducing the dose a little bit. Maybe it's losing some body fat. That's the way typically you wouldn't, as a prescribing doctor, you wouldn't give someone who's obese testosterone, right? Because you're just going to aromatize. I'm not against using an AI. I think an AI is a tool, and I think it can be used appropriately when it's needed to crush your estrogen. I don't agree with it all outside of like peak week in a bodybuilding show. I think that's where the misconception came from, is that we realized estrogen had some health benefits, right? It's neuroprotective and it cardioprotective to a degree. And we realized we shouldn't be crushing it like it was done in the early 2000s. And then everyone took that and they ran with it. And they were like, well, if it's cardioprotective here, it must be even better if it's here.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, well, that's very American to think bigger is better, but that doesn't mean you're actually helping yourself. And if you look at what high estrogen looks like, is that really the look you want? Like you want big hips and a big butt and water retention? Like that's not really what a bodybuilder is going for. So I never understood that thought. And none of the top coaches, at least that I know, run estrogen high. I think a lot of guys kept their mouths shut for a while until I started talking about it, but I don't know anyone that does it. Like AJ and I do videos together and we follow the same protocol. You know, Justin probably does something similar. Harris, you know, Paul, Burnett, like we're all the same thought process on this stuff. I think I would manage estrogen appropriately though. Like if you're on steroids, you could use, depending again on your risk and what you're going to use, you could use something like a THT, but again, it's not legal, right? So like, I'm going to be hesitant to like recommend a drug that's not FDA approved, that's illegal. And why add more milligrams if you don't need to have more milligrams? It's easy to me. It's easier to use an AI that's been proven than it is to necessarily just add something like, you know, Masteron or Primobolan. Because first of all, do you even know if that's real? Like I see tons of Masteron and Primobolan that's fake.
Yeah.
So most guys don't have access.
Those two in particular, I see, you know, not
it's mostly EQ. Like Primobolan doesn't crush your estrogen. That's EQ that's doing that. If you notice that you take something that's doing that. The other thing is the theory that an AI is dangerous and Masteron is safe. That's quite probably the most preposterous thing I've ever heard, because Masteron's never been studied in men. It's been studied in rats and females, and the FDA removed it because it caused side effects. It's not been proven as an anabolic. There was like one study where it caused muscle growth in women with cancer, but like, are you a woman with cancer? Like almost anything that prevents muscle loss in them is going to cause growth. And you would have to run it in order to be effective at gram quantities. So you're saying to me, a milligram of Arimidex is somehow deadly, even though it's been studied, but yet 1,400 milligrams or 2,000 milligrams of Masteron is safe. That's where bodybuilding is now, and that drives me up the wall. It doesn't make any sense, and there's a reason why it's not approved. And I argued with a cardiologist the other day who said he was telling a patient that Arimidex would cause a cardiovascular event for this guy. And I said, let's go to PubMed right now, and you find me a study that shows in men Arimidex causes a heart attack. And he couldn't find one. I said, because there isn't one. It doesn't do that. Yeah. Crushing your estrogen can be, but you're talking A to C, you're not A to B on that one. It's like you're making these gross assumptions based on something that's not medicine.
I'm so happy that you, because I either deal with the guy who's really worried about his hormones and wants to get on TRT for the first time, or someone who's like a little bit more advanced and they're flirting with adding more drugs, more this, more that. And I can't tell you, both with dealing with people directly or just from assholes online, how many times the answer is like, but you're 28% body fat. Like, I mean, that, and because I deal with so many people who are like, you know, I've gotten a little bit leaner. Now it's time for me to get, and I was like, whoa, no, you haven't. Like, and I think there's a really distorted, getting back to that, what I was talking about, the hyper reality, but there's so many people who are like, I was 6% body fat. I was like, you're lucky if you're 16. I think we have a very distorted idea. Like, how about just deal with, let's get you into a healthy body fat range. And then we can start talking about, and by the way, if you wanted to add mass, it'll work a lot better if you were 12% body fat. As
Everything
opposed
works
to,
better when you're leaner.
And so it's very hard because I had a conversation about it with someone the other day, and I said, look, yeah, I'm 175 pounds, so I'm talking about like bodybuilding advice. I understand. All the time I deal with dudes online who are like, yeah, but you're little. Yeah, but you're little, blah, 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 blah. 100% of the time, I'm not 100% of the time, it's fat dudes. Yeah. No shredded pro, no shredded like fitness model. No, none of my friend Mike Safiu just won Natural Mr. Olympia a couple years ago. Like they've never once been like, oh, but you're so little. They'd be like, oh man, you look like you've been training hard, you've been dieting. No one besides fat dudes come with you're looking small. You're looking
people
small.
that are in shape generally don't insult other people.
And it's like that.
Like, who cares? We all know what it takes to be in shape. No one's going after anyone else that's in shape.
Right.
I think just to back up real fast so people understand, because I get this question at least every day, if not multiple times a day. So so people are concerned about estrogen and IGF. So IGF is related to insulin. It's a peptide hormone. The role of estrogen in the human liver is through the immune system. It has nothing to do with IGF. So estrogen is needed so the immune system can function, because at the liver is where a lot of this stuff starts. What stimulates IGF production is protein and insulin and glucose. It's a food sensor, right? That's why you don't grow muscle in the woods if you have no food. It's not like all of a sudden my estrogen got elevated and I'm just going to grow muscle. That, like, the whole theory makes no sense. And also, if you look at the structure of those two hormones, IGF versus estrogen, they're not even related. One is a steroid hormone, one is a peptide hormone. They don't interact. They don't deal with the same sensors, receptors. They're not similar at all. So that's something that needs to go away in the bodybuilding industry, because it's just not, I'm not even sure where it came from. We use IGF in serum to test for disease, like in giantism and stuff. When it's elevated, you're causing systemic issues. But like for all of us, you care what your serum level of IGF is. It's not doing anything.
I have a question for you, because we're on IGF-1 here. So, a lot of people will check IGF-1 to see if growth hormone is working. And I have a two-part question, question here is like, I do see like a lot of people utilizing, peptides, growth hormone peptides. Those seem to not raise IGF-1, not talking MK677, more of like your CJCs and your ipamorelins. Growth hormone, for some people, I do see it elevate, or maybe raising growth hormone binding protein. I'll look at either one of those. Why would someone want to check that if it's not doing much in serum, if someone is using exogenous growth hormone or say MK677?
Well, so MK677 will work differently. So MK677 is a valid drug. It's on its way actually becoming a prescription drug for children with delayed growth. It's a valid treatment for children, and it's a valid treatment for elderly people. For guys it's not going to do a whole lot. It might make you have better sleep. It's not going to change your body composition. It'll make you hungry. That's because it's only stimulating your pituitary gland to work better. It can only deal with the max output that it's capable of. So for all of us, like we've declined in what we're outputting, but it's not like horribly, so you put out like 2 milligrams a day or 1 milligram a day versus like 4 milligrams when you were younger. It's not that big of a difference. It's still a valid test. If you wanted to know if you bought like a generic kit of growth hormone, you want to see if it's still good. It's an okay test to see, like, assuming you do it very recently after the injection, to see if it's elevated. It'll show you, to some degree, if the growth hormone's okay. Sometimes people fake growth hormone, they'll put IGF LR3 because it's cheaper. So like that'll elevate that too. I would do a growth hormone serum test, but you have to, again, do it really quickly. You have to like basically pin and go to the doctor and get labs done. Yeah. Anyone's ever used real growth hormone, when it's real. That's like, to me, there's no mistaking. Growth hormone is like very strong when it's real. If you use enough of it, like, it's fairly obvious within a couple of weeks if it's working or not. And you can.
The reason I ask is I knew somebody who purchased growth hormone from a legitimate pharmacy, and this individual could not get elevations in his IGF-1, and then swap. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, so you have 7 binding proteins. Humans have 7 binding proteins. Number 7 is debatable. We argue if that's a real binding protein. Cattle have 5. They have 1 through 5. I mean, they have 2. They have 2 through 6. They lack 1. 1 is the one that's most estrogen responsive, and this is where a lot of the misconceptions. I'm just explaining why people are confused about this. So in the Trenbolone data, what basically with Merck and the Revlar pellets, we add estradiol to those pellets because cattle don't have binding protein 1. So when you add estrogen to a male cow, steer, it basically will grow more. But humans have binding protein 1, which basically estrogen renders our growth useless. We're not ruminants. So we respond differently to different things. Obviously, we're not related to cattle. So it's possible that that individual, either the way that they're excreting it, the way they're metabolizing it, could be something in their liver, something in their kidneys. They might just be excreting it more. It doesn't mean the growth hormone's not good. I have one kidney. My IGF and serum tends to run very high because I don't excrete it at the same rate as some people. Mm-hmm. I've also seen pro bodybuilders who use a bottle a day and their IGF's like a 150, but they're massive and they're using legitimate 30 IUs of growth hormone a day. So I don't think it's really a test that has a lot of relevance to like the output per se, if that makes any sense. I think the problem is it's so confusing that people just want an answer. Raising your estrogen is not necessarily the answer, though, to getting an outcome from growth hormone.
I think when we look at endocrine function and how things work, it's never black and white. And there's a lot of people who portray it as it's like, hey, this is the only answer. And I'm like, well, if you knew anything about endocrine function, it's not, because it's all an orchestra and everything's kind of moving in symphony. So a lot of different things can kind of influence certain pathways.
Yeah, I mean, and the amount, I mean, and you know, like I took a thyroid class that lasted a year. Like there's an amazing amount of stuff you have to learn about each of these glands. Like I forget more than I can retain. So it's anyone that wants to sum up any of the things that we talk about in these like really simple statements, like, oh, it's because, is that really the case always? I don't know. I wish it were that simple. Like you can't sum up something as complicated as hypertrophy or hyperplasia in like a statement.
So dealer's choice. I can move around, but this is the one I pulled up. We're talking about insulin receptors, GLUT4, glucose.
I was just putting up so I can read what I wrote because I don't remember what I wrote.
You don't have it all memorized? I mean, you're hundreds and hundreds of posts where you're breaking down at a deep microscopic level what's going on in the cellular physiology. Come on now.
Oh, about insulin resistance.
You should just write, it's one sentence. Isn't that what you're supposed to do on Instagram? One sentence, explain it all.
One sentence, it's so simple. It's just basically the different mechanisms in which, you know, basically when we bombard, as relevant to bodybuilding athletes, it's just because we tend to eat too much too often and our blood sugar is constantly elevated, right? And then if you take things like growth hormone that are going to constantly allow that to occur as well, you're just, the receptors that allow the glucose in just can't deal with it anymore. And then it circulates back to the liver. It'll become a triglyceride, and then your triglycerides go up. But I don't know, you guys probably notice when you see people's labs, first you see the blood sugar go up, and then if you look at it again in a month, the triglycerides are creeping up. You got big problems when that starts to occur.
Perfect storm for metabolic syndrome. You know, people are like, oh no, it's, you know, my blood sugar is not an issue. I'm like, well, your triglycerides are double the reference range. What are your thoughts on like, you know, ApoA and ApoB, and do you look at those in bodybuilders and you think that there's relevance there for cardiovascular risk?
Yeah, definitely. Much better than, I mean, I think it's valid to look at things like cholesterol and triglycerides, but I don't think they give us really the whole story. We know androgens are going to drop HDL, and it's going to depend on what you're using, the dose you're using, and your genetic response. Like it stimulates basically the excretion. Androgens directly stimulate the excretion of HDL. So you basically you're not producing enough of it and allowing enough to go in. So there's just really no way to run a cycle and have great HDL. You can have decent, I guess, depending on what you're running. If you're running really strong androgens, so it's going to be tough.
I think you make a great point there, because I've seen people who may be using like a statin agent, someone who comes into the clinic, they're already on a statin. And, you know, they're using something like an oxandrolone low dose, and they're upset that their HDL suppressed. I'm like, well, nothing else really moved. You know, your cholesterol's completely inhibited because you have the statin agent in place, but the HDL suppressed. So, you know, that's usually what I try to tell people is like, I've only seen 1 or 2 people who were able to use a high dose of something else and not have suppression of HDL. We all usually will have some significant reduction there.
You have to. I mean, that's just the way the body works. I don't typically get concerned with people on steroid cycles unless the HDL is really low. It's like single digits is scary to me. You know, if you see it in the 20s or 30s, it's not great. Like but it's not long term, right? That's the kind of guy you like. just so you're aware, like these aren't great numbers. Like we want to be really aware of this stuff. You want to do more cardio, more fiber, more fish oil. You want to do those other lifestyle things to kind of balance that out a little bit, and then get off the high dose sooner than later, right? But you see guys before, I've seen guys in show prep that they have like a 5 HDL. That's
it's really interesting how anabolic steroids can also drive ApoB. At least in my experience, I see that. Like, you may be under 80 and then we start driving dose, and that's doubled, and cholesterol may have not moved a lot, but those lipoproteins seem to build up over time. And I'm in the same stance of you as like the safer risk model is like, hey, 3 months of this is probably not going to be detrimental, but doing this for 10 years and never looking at your lipids, you're probably going to run into some issues. And I know some top level guys who do not do labs. Like I know one specific person here I know locally, he's like, I'm too scared to look. I'm like, well, it would make a lot more sense to
I'm too scared to look.
Idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem, is that a lot of these guys don't come off. Like in theory, I don't have a problem with, let's say, blasting and cruising. Like I'm not necessarily a proponent of guys fully coming off either, because the health risks of like coming fully off are not always worth that. But I think if you go to a TRT level, like you should spend half your year at some sort of TRT level.
Mental health.
Right? But these pros are literally banging. Like I have one pro who his cruise is at 3 grams. That's his cruise.
And if you're at a TRT dose for the healthy individual, you can restore your health. The testosterone replacement is for health. So it's like you should be able to regain your cholesterol back into within a normal range. And, it shouldn't be hard to, regain those things, granted, if you're coming down. And in my personal opinions, I'm not a super huge bodybuilder, but I'm able to retain my tissue on, 200 milligrams of testosterone. Yeah.
Yeah. Does it mean indefinitely? No. And does it mean your body composition will stay the same as it was on a cycle? Probably not. But like you probably have 2 or 3 months before it starts to really go down, unless your diet sucks, right? Or you just stop training. Some of those guys just literally stop doing shit when they're off drugs.
There's so much connected lifestyle stuff too. It's like, if I'm not blasting, then I'm going to sleep 4 hours and I'm going to train like shit. And
I'm going to drink and eat fast food. And exactly. Dude, I'm like, it doesn't work that way.
The new science, which is really fascinating about why it's important to go back either off or to a TRT dose, is your stem cells and organ repair. So what was discovered was when you're blasting androgens as an adult, you only have a set amount of stem cells left, right? We're not children. You don't have tons of these. You have what they call pluripotent ones that are basically in a general pool, and they can become any kind of stem cell within reason that the body needs. The problem is when you're on huge amounts of androgens, they get pulled to go into muscle cells. So your things like your liver and your kidneys that rely on these cells to regenerate no longer have access to them, because your body doesn't have a choice. Now it has to prioritize muscle because you forced it to. So if you stay on that dose for a year now, and on top of it, you now take something that stresses your kidneys out, right? You're not, and they can't heal. And that's why you see these autopsies, these guys, their kidneys are this big, right? Because they literally never came off drugs, and then they took diuretics, and they did all these other things. Their blood pressure was high, and they destroy these organs, and they couldn't heal, because naturally these organs will heal on their own. That to me, that's a bigger risk than just cholesterol and the blood markers. Obviously, the markers should come back down when you go back to a regular dose.
I agree with you though. Blood pressure is probably the biggest thing. And I, just curious of like, when I started bodybuilding, like 2010, blood pressure wasn't something. I had a coach, and that's not a question. I would be curious for, you guys who may be competing in the late 90s, early 90s, was there any type of diagnostics? Did anybody really look at anything? It was just like, hey, take the drugs and go.
Yeah. I mean, and orals were probably used more back then, right? I think things were more reckless. There was less, even though we just talked trash about the internet, there was less knowledge, I think. Like a lot of the guys that I knew back then, they just didn't know how to use things. You would just ask someone else in the gym. So you'd be like, I'm going to buy a box of Deca, and I'm just going to run an amp of Deca a day alone and see what happens. And you felt horrible.
What made it across the border that month is really the extent.
Yeah. So it's with the golden era guys are like, oh, in the golden era they only ran that because that's all that one doctor in Los Angeles could prescribe. It's not because that's what they wanted to run. Like Mike Menzer would have eaten drugs off the bathroom floor if they were available. It was just, there was nothing available. Nowadays, everyone has access to whatever you want in any dose, right? It's like
There's a lot of rad gyno too. There's a lot of rad gyno indeed.
Yeah, no, it's good stuff. Any other questions for Kurt?
I had one quick one is, because I'd love to hear you talk about it on a grander scale, because I had a small kind of issue with it. But what about the mental health aspect? Like when the physical stuff gets too out of control, then it leads to the mental health. I had, since moving here I grew up at sea level and in a very dry environment. And I didn't even really know I had asthmatic problems. Go to see the doctor, identifies it. Sure enough, he's, albuterol and like even over-the-counter ephedrine, bronchate and whatnot. So I'm like, fuck yeah, sweet. And I get to get shredded. Next thing I know, I'm finding that I'm having sleeplessness, obviously, which made a little bit of sense. But then I'm short. I'm feeling like I'm a bit more moody than I would be under normal circumstances. Then I go to get my blood work done. My blood pressure's higher than out of the blue. And I'm like, what is going on? And it took me so long to kind of backtrack, realize what it was, and then realize what was really more important, blah, blah, blah. And that's a very small issue when we're talking about, the ephedra and stuff like that, albuterol, whatnot. I wonder what it must be like when you're talking about seriously powerful hormones on a grand scale. How much does the psychological effects sometimes take over?
I think a lot. I feel like I want to do a video. You guys are welcome to be on. I think that we could do a whole panel video with mental health and steroids and bodybuilding, because I think that there's a lot of stuff that no one ever discusses. As a coach, I see tons of it. I've experienced my own issues with it. 19ers are notorious, all of them, for that sort of stuff. Even DHTs to some extent. If you run enough of anything, like, you're not necessarily well. And I'm married, so I'm told, my wife was very honest with me. She'll tell me when I'm not doing well.
Right.
Because she'll, you know what I mean? She's like, whatever you're doing now, please stop doing that. I think there's a big deal. I've had guys that we've had to stop because they were going to harm themselves. Like, I think that it's a serious thing that no one talks about, right? Because most guys that are in bodybuilding probably start from a place where we're a little off anyway. Like, if you're willing to go that extreme, you're probably not normal. So I think we all probably start with something off, and then the drugs magnify those things. And I think then our constant pushing and pushing and pushing, right? And like, our food is weird. We're hungry sometimes we're really full. Our sleep gets really disrupted. Show prep is a miserable thing.
Miserable, yeah.
Miserable. I mean, anyone who's dieted like that, I mean, that's a mental thing.
I've seen in follow-up questionnaires too, clinically, they'll say like risk-taking behavior, has it gone up? Like, I'll have them scale it, because even those lower amounts in like a TRT, like, some guys, they think they're Superman, and then all of a sudden, whatever it is, like, maybe it's a really risky investment, maybe it's gambling, maybe it's, flirtatious activities, etc. When they're married and they would have never done that before, just being more aggressive and other risky behaviors, etc. Like, I've seen a lot of that, be reported. Now, granted, that was more general population, but it was like, I got all this drive, I got all this stuff, like, and I can take on the world now. And it's like, just let it settle, because over time they would kind of settle off. But I can only imagine too, like, the higher you get in your androgen load, like how much that would skew that thought process. And I've had guys say, like, I don't know what I was thinking. I'm like, yeah, I have a pretty good idea of what may have got you to think that, but I remember what you were doing back then. But
I mean, anyone who's used, like, during prep, anyone who's used halotestin and tren together, you have that, Masteron, and a bunch of other really aggressive androgens. I mean, there's many times my wife has told me to go take a walk. Like, you don't even realize what you're doing. Like, you can hear things coming out of your mouth, but you're so illogical at that point. And it's just like, it's ridiculous. Like,
I'm glad you said that too, about like the embarrassment. Like, a lot of times guys will be even reluctant to be open about identifying that kind of stuff.
No one wants to talk about it, right? Because
I only felt comfortable talking about it because it was so minimal. Talking about, like, I would take the inhaler of the albuterol or something, and I got a little bit more annoyed at my daughter's stupid music. But if it was something serious where I was considering harming myself, I probably would keep that shit to myself, so I think it's really important to kind of get that out there.
Yeah, and I'm not obviously not saying names, but yeah, I had a pro who he had to go to the hospital because he was not well. I mean, I don't think it's that rare. I think it just people don't discuss it, but I think it's important that we get it out there, because it is something people need to understand. I'm not against things like people probably hear me talk outwardly against things like trend. Again, it's a tool in the drawer. Like it has a use for, it has a function. It's just, if you're young and you're not necessarily stable, it's not necessarily something you want to take around. I remember the first time I took it, my wife was trying to hand me a piece of paper. My children were little at this time. Like, this is embarrassing because I feel like an idiot. Like, my wife was handing me a piece of paper and it fell on the floor and I went off. Like, I was like, why the F did you throw that at me? You shouldn't throw it at me. My wife is like the nicest person. Right. It's like you totally misinterpret everything that's going on around you, and it's just 0 to 60.
I think most people just make light of it, honestly. Like, I sit in a circle with a bunch of bodybuilders at the gym, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I was driving down the highway, and I'm on trend. I'm in show prep, and I'm screaming at someone." I'm like, "Dude, that's just not normal behavior." I'm like, "It's not something to joke about, But I hear it all the time. Is no one wants to really admit it's like, hey, that is a serious concern of like, you shouldn't be having these erratic behaviors. And I haven't really met many people who can take trend, at a higher dose, who are not sound. I think that it kind of impacts us all to a degree.
Yeah. I mean, I think over time you do get more used to, like, you build a tolerance for anything. But that being said, I don't think it's ever like a sane thing to use. It shouldn't be used like yearly or all around, and it adds, I think those guys tend to be aggressive and a little off more than normal people anyway. And you see a lot of, again, I don't want to name anyone. I talked to a coach the other day who's a well-known coach who's not doing well. Just I think from years of doing this stuff, like, it's really sad because you would never know this. He's still present on the internet, but he's not well. This is something that's like a kind of a big deal.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to unpack that a little bit further too. Justin, any other topics that you had in mind?
No, not really. I don't want to keep Kurt forever. I'm sure I could ramble for hours.
But like I said, we can talk. We can, and you guys, we could all do whatever you guys want anytime you want. I'm always open to make content. I think this is.
I appreciate it.
To me, this is super important. Like, I would rather spend the time like educating, like getting this stuff out there,
right?
Because no one's talking about any of this stuff. And I think if we can counteract the damage that's done with the misinformation, we have a louder voice eventually if we all keep talking about it.
Right.
That's a good point, man.
All right.